The year is 1870. The French Empire is collapsing. An entire army, with Emperor Napoleon the Third himself, is surrounded at Sedan, facing total annihilation. But in the small village of Bazeilles, 2,000 French Marines have just received an order: hold this position at all costs. They are outnumbered 20 to 1. They are about to show the world what "to the last cartridge" truly means. The catastrophe of 1870 did not begin on the battlefield. It began in a drawing room. It began with the arrogance of an aging empire, the Second French Empire, led by an emperor, Napoleon the Third, who carried his uncle's name but possessed none of his genius. He was a man haunted by the legacy of the first Napoleon, desperate to recapture that gloire, that glory. But his judgment was clouded by illness and by a court that told him only what he wanted to hear. They believed France was, as it had been for 2 centuries, the supreme land power in Europe. They believed their army, victorious in the Crimea and in Italy, was invincible. They were fatally wrong. Across the Rhine, a new power had risen, a hard, grey, industrial power: Prussia. And it was led by a man who made no such mistakes, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was not a soldier. He was a political engineer. He understood that a unified Germany, a new German empire, could only be born from a war with France. But he would not be the aggressor. He would make France declare the war. He set his trap with the cold patience of a spider: the Ems dispatch. A minor diplomatic dispute over the Spanish throne was skillfully edited, twisted, and leaked to the press. It was designed to be the perfect insult, making it seem the Prussian king had snubbed the French ambassador. It worked perfectly. In Paris, the crowds roared for war. The government, led by the weak Émile Ollivier, declared that it accepted the challenge with a light heart. A light heart. They were walking into the abyss. The French army marched to war in the summer of 1870, still believing in the romance of the charge. They believed in élan, in the fiery, passionate spirit of the French soldier. They believed above all in their rifle, the chassepot. It was, on paper, a masterpiece. A bolt-action needle gun, it was arguably the finest infantry rifle in the world. It had a greater range, a better gas seal, and a faster rate of fire than the Prussian Dries rifle, the weapon that had won the war against Austria just 4 years earlier. The French infantryman could kill a Prussian before the Prussian was even in range. This was their ace. This was their war-winning technology. But the Prussians had built their army not around the rifle, but around the gun, the Prussian Krupp cannon. This was the true god of this new industrial battlefield. These guns were made of steel, not bronze. They were breech-loading, not muzzle-loading. They fired farther, faster, and with devastatingly accurate explosive shells, while the French were still often using outdated cannons that fired solid shot. The French generals, trained in the Napoleonic cult of the bayonet charge, fundamentally misunderstood the new mathematics of war. They saw artillery as a supporting arm, something to prepare the way for the infantry. The Prussians, under the chillingly modern doctrine of their great strategist, Helmuth von Moltke, saw artillery as the killer. The infantry was merely there to occupy the ground the cannons had already cleared. This was a war of staff officers against romantics. It was a war of coordinated logistics against passionate chaos. The clash, when it came in August 1870, was not a battle. It was a demolition. At the Battle of Bazeilles, French cavalry, in their magnificent plumed helmets and shining breastplates, did what they had always done. They charged. They charged directly into the invisible, long-range fire of the Prussian infantry and the devastating, accurate shelling of the Krupp guns. They were annihilated. They never even reached the line. At Spicheren, on the same day, The story repeated. French courage against Prussian coordination. French passion against German mathematics. Mathematics won. In less than 2 weeks, the professional French Imperial Army, the finest force the Emperor possessed, was shattered. It was split in two. The primary army, the Army of the Rhine, led by Marshal François Achille Bazaine, was reeling. Bazaine was not a fool, but he was a man defined by caution. He was a product of the old system. He allowed himself to be pushed back, outmaneuvered, and finally, horrifyingly, bottled up. He retreated into the fortress city of Metz. It was a fatal decision. Moltke, the Prussian spider, simply spun his web. He surrounded Metz with 150,000 German troops, sealing Bazaine and 180,000 of France's best soldiers inside. They were trapped. The main French army was now off the board, reduced to the status of prisoners in their own fortress. In Paris, the news was received with disbelief, then panic. The government was collapsing. The Emperor, Napoleon the Third, was now desperate. He was ill, racked with pain from bladder stones, sometimes barely able to sit on his horse. He had to do something. He had to save Bazaine. It was a matter of political and dynastic survival. He scraped together a new army at the camp of Chalons. This was not the elite, professional force now trapped in Metz. The army of Chalons was a chaotic mix of survivors from birth, raw new conscripts who barely knew how to fire their rifles, reserve units, and the naval garrison troops from Paris. It was a hollow army, and it was led by Marshal MacMahon, a brave cavalryman who had been wounded and defeated at Firth, and who knew, with a soldier's grim certainty, that the plan he was being ordered to execute was suicidal. The order was insane: march the army of Chalons, 120,000 strong, eastwards. March it along the Belgian border in a desperate looping Hail Mary pass to try and break through the German lines and relieve Bazaine at Metz. It was a march into the jaws of the trap. Moltke, learning of this move, was supposedly overjoyed. The French were doing his work for him. He simply wheeled his massive German armies, the Third and the Fourth, northwards. They moved with a speed and coordination the French could not comprehend. They would pin Napoleon's last army against the border before it could ever reach Bazaine. The French march was a disaster. It was slow. It was disorganized. The conscripts were exhausted. The command structure was bickering. They were marching not to a battle, but into an encirclement. By August 31st, the trap had snapped shut. The army of Chalons was cornered in the valley of the Meuse River, trapped in and around the fortress town of Sedan. The Emperor himself was with them. The Germans held all the surrounding hills, their hundreds of Krupp cannons looking down on the French like gods on an arena floor. The battle, to be fought the next day, was not a battle. It was an execution. This desperate, dying army, now trapped in the cauldron of Sedan, contained one unit forged from a different, harder material. A unit that did not share the army's panic. A unit that would not accept the logic of surrender. But in this chaotic, disintegrating mass of the army of Chalons, this tide of demoralized conscripts and defeated regulars, led by a sick emperor and a general who knew the campaign, was hopeless. There was one element forged from a different, harder material. One instrument that was not yet broken. They were the 12th Corps, but more specifically, the division under General de Vassoigne. They were known by their colour, not the madder red trousers of the regular line infantry, the infamous pantalon rouge. Those red trousers, so visible, so perfect for parade grounds and so suicidal on a modern battlefield, had become a symbol of France's fatal arrogance, a refusal to adapt to the new realities of rifled warfare. No, these men wore a deep, functional, sombre blue. They were the Blue Division. Who were these men? The name Troupes de Marine is a source of constant, profound confusion for English-speaking historians, a confusion that obscures their true nature. The name conjures images of Britain's Royal Marines or the United States Marine Corps, soldiers stationed on warships, specialists in amphibious assault, naval gunnery, and ship-to-ship boarding actions. This assumption, while logical, is entirely incorrect. The men in the blue coats were not the Fusiliers Marins, the French Navy's sailors trained as infantry, though they too would fight bravely in the defence of Paris. These were the Troupes de Marine. They were colonial infantry. They were, in fact, an arm of the army, but one funded, administered and controlled by the Ministry of the Navy and Colonies. This bureaucratic distinction was vital. It meant they were outside the normal army structure with their own traditions, their own supply chains, and their own culture. Their purpose was not to fight on ships. Their purpose was to conquer and hold France's burgeoning 19th century empire. Their famous insignia, the Golden Anchor, symbolized not the decks they served on, but the global reach of the empire they were sent to protect. An empire stretching from the sugar islands of the Caribbean to the coast of Senegal, from the deserts of Algeria to the jungles of Cochinchina. This separation from the regular army was key. The French line army, the Lignards, was built on a system of conscription that had been watered down since the Napoleonic Wars. It was filled with men serving 7-year terms, often pulled reluctantly from farms and workshops, who had spent much of their service in dreary garrison towns, endlessly practicing the precise, robotic drills of linear warfare. Their commanders were a mixed bag of peninsular veterans, aristocratic appointees, and men who had bought their way into rank. Their morale was brittle. When the Prussian Krupp guns began their systematic industrial slaughter at Worth, that morale had shattered. The Marsouins, as the Marines were nicknamed, were a different breed entirely. They were not conscripts. They were long-service volunteers. They were, in the language of the time, lifers. They were men who had chosen the hard, dangerous, and often thankless life of a colonial soldier. It was a career, not an obligation. This meant their average age was higher. Their level of experience was incomparable. They were professionals in an army of amateurs. Their esprit de corps was not a theoretical concept from a training manual. It was a brutal, shared reality, forged in the most unforgiving environments on earth. Many in their ranks were veterans of Algeria. They had not been fighting a conventional European war. They had fought for decades in the dusty canyons of the Atlas Mountains and the scorching, fly-blown plains of the Tell. They had fought a relentless, patient and savage counterinsurgency against the fierce tribal warriors of Abd el-Qaeda. This was not the linear warfare of Europe. It was a war of razzias, raids, of sudden ambushes, of quick, punishing marches, and of ruthless adaptation. They learned to travel light, to fight on minimal rations, to build fortified bivouacs in minutes, and to trust the man next to them with their life. They learned a hardness, a débrouillardise, a cynical, practical ability to get things done, that the soldiers of the line, garrisoned in leafy French towns, could not comprehend. Others in their ranks wore the ribbons of an even more disastrous and therefore more hardening campaign, the failed Mexican intervention in the 1860s. They had been part of the expeditionary force sent to prop up the puppet Emperor Maximilian. They had fought alongside the Foreign Legion in engagements that would become legend, like the stand at Cameroni. They had garrisoned Veracruz, a coastal city so rife with vomito negro, yellow fever, that a posting there was considered a death sentence, a place where soldiers died in their beds more often than in battle. They had fought Mexican Juaristas in chaotic street battles, high-altitude mountain skirmishes, and against irregular guerrilleros. They knew what it meant to fight in a foreign land, surrounded by a hostile population, with supply lines stretched to the breaking point. They had learned resilience in the face of political collapse and logistical failure. They knew how to build a barricade, they knew how to clear a house, and they knew how to hold a position against impossible odds. This was not theoretical, this was muscle memory, and still others were veterans of an even more distant and alien theatre, Cochinchina. They had fought in the Mekong Delta, in the suffocating, near-liquid humidity and monsoon rains of what is now Vietnam. They battled tropical diseases like dysentery and malaria that rotted an army from the inside out. They navigated jungle warfare, fighting an often invisible enemy in villages and rice paddies. They were the tip of the imperial spear, the men sent to plant the tricolour on the far side of the world. They were, in short, the French equivalent of the British redcoats, who had fought at Balaclava or in the Indian Mutiny, men for whom combat was not an aberration, but a way of life. This combined experience, Africa, America, Asia, created a unique soldier. They were known by their nickname Marsouins, the porpoises, a name earned according to legend, because like the porpoise, they were equally at home on sea, during the months-long transports, and on land, where they did their fighting. They were tough, they were adaptable, they were incredibly, stubbornly proud. In an army that was breaking apart under the sheer mechanical weight of Prussian strategy, the Marsouins maintained their cohesion. They were a family. They trusted their officers, who, unlike many in the regular army, had risen by surviving these same colonial hells, not by purchasing their commissions or networking in the salons of Paris. An officer in the Troupe de Marine had earned his rank in the same mud and blood as his men. This created a bond of mutual respect, a professional trust that the conscript army, with its vast gulf between officer and enlisted man, simply could not replicate. Their visual identity set them apart, a visible symbol of their elite status. While the regular French line infantry, the Lignards, were famous for their pantalon rouge, the red trousers that made them such tragically visible targets on a grey battlefield. The Marines wore their functional dark blue greatcoats, the capote, and dark blue trousers. In the chaos of Sedan, this blue uniform became a symbol. It was the colour of professionalism. It was the colour of the last reliable wall against which the German tide would break. This blue division, formerly the 1st Infantry Division of the 12th Corps, was led by General de Vassoigne. He was a commander who understood exactly what he had. He had the best, most reliable infantry in the entire army. He knew they were the backbone of Marshal MacMahon's desperate, disorganised force. When the army of Charlon stumbled into the Sedan trap, it was no surprise that the Marsouins were given the most critical, the most exposed, and therefore the most dangerous sector of the defence. They were the professionals. They were the reliable ones. They were the army's fire brigade, its anchor, its last faint hope. On the 31st of August, 1870, the strategic situation for the army of Chalons was not merely desperate, it was terminal. The long, agonising and badly managed march eastwards, that phantom chase to save Marshal Bazaine's army already trapped in Metz, had failed. It had been a fool's errand from the start, a march dictated by the panic of Parisian politics, not by the cold, hard realities of military strategy. And now the army itself was caught. The brilliant, ruthless pincer movement of Helmuth von Moltke, the cold, academic brain of the Prussian General Staff, had worked with the precision of a scalpel. Two massive German armies, the Third and the Fourth, a combined force totaling perhaps 200,000 men, had converged on the demoralized, exhausted, and bewildered French force of 120,000. They had pushed them, herded them, into the deep, narrow, fog-choked valley of the Meuse River. The army, with the Emperor Napoleon the Third himself carried along with it, a sick man racked with pain, found itself trapped in the ancient, decaying fortress town of Sedan. It was a bowl. It was a perfect, natural cauldron, a death trap. And all around them, on the overlooking hills of La Marfée and Floing, the Germans were placing their artillery. Hundreds upon hundreds of the deadly Krupp steel cannons were being wheeled into position, their long black barrels glinting in the late summer sun, creating a perfect, unbroken 360-degree ring of fire. The French soldiers, looking up from the valley floor, could see the glint of steel on every hilltop. They were not in a fortress, they were in an execution pit. The French High Command, paralysed by the Emperor's presence and the bickering of his generals, stared at their maps and saw only one thin, desperate thread of hope. One theoretical, almost imaginary escape route. To the southeast of Sedan, nestled in a loop of the river, lay the village of Bazeilles. It was a seemingly unremarkable collection of solid stone houses, bourgeois villas, small workshops, and a single ancient church. It was a village built to last. But strategically, it was everything. It controlled the vital railway bridge over the Meuse River. This bridge, this single iron and stone artery, was the last link connecting the trapped army to the rest of France. It was the only way out. If the French could hold Bazeilles, if they could keep that bridge open, they might, just might, be able to fight their way clear. They could punch a hole in the encirclement and retreat south towards Paris, to live to fight another day. It was the army's only lung. The Germans knew this. Moltke, studying his own maps in the candlelight, saw Bazeilles not as a village, but as the linchpin of the entire operation. It was the final seal on the tomb. To complete the encirclement, to ensure the total, unmitigated annihilation of the French army and the capture of the Emperor himself, that escape route had to be closed. The order was given to the 1st Bavarian Corps, commanded by General Ludwig von der Thahn. The Bavarians were not Prussians. They were allies, eager to prove their martial worth in this new, emerging Germany. They, later reinforced by other German units as the fighting intensified, swelling their sector strength to a massive force of perhaps 38,000, maybe even 45,000 men, were given a simple, brutal, and vital task. Take Bazeilles. Take the bridge. Take it at all costs. Slam the door shut. Standing against this Bavarian wave was the elite Blue Division. General de Vassoigne, understanding the stakes, assigned his very best men to this impossible, sacrificial defence. The entire division, perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 strong, held the general sector around Bazeilles, a line of defence that had to absorb the first, most violent shock of the German assault. But the village of Bazeilles itself, the choke point, the absolute centre of the storm, would be held by a much smaller, almost token force. The exact numbers are lost in the chaos of the battle, shrouded by the fog of war, by propaganda, and by contradictory after-action reports. This is a critical point of contention, but the most reliable consensus suggests that perhaps only 2,000, maybe 2,300 French Marines, primarily from the 2nd and 3rd Marine Infantry Regiments, were actually in the village when the first shots were fired. 2,000 professionals waiting in the cold, wet darkness. The German commanders, looking down from the heights, knew that Bazeilles was the cork in the bottle. To win the war, to capture an emperor, they had to pull that cork. The night of August 31st was a cold, tense vigil. A thick river fog, born from the Meuse, clung to the valley floor, blinding all sides. At 4 o'clock in the morning on September 1st, 1870, the 1st Bavarian assault wave, elite pioneers with axes and rifles, began to move forward. They rode silently across the river in the pre-dawn gloom. The battle for Bazeilles had begun. The attack began at 4 o'clock in the morning on September 1st, 1870. It did not begin with the thunder of cannons or the sounding of bugles. It began with silence. It began with a thick, wet river fog that clung to the valley of the Meuse, a ghostly shroud that blinded both sides and reduced the world to a grey, muffled void. In this pre-dawn gloom, the 1st Bavarian assault waves, elite pioneers, moved forward. They were the engineers, the specialists, men armed not just with rifles but with axes and the grim knowledge of demolition. They rowed silently across the river on pontoon boats, their shapes swallowed by the mist. They achieved complete, chilling, tactical surprise. The French pickets, the sentries of the Blue Division stationed along the riverbank, were peering into a wall of white. They could see nothing. They could hear nothing, perhaps, but the faint, muffled splash of an oar, a sound mistaken for a fish or debris. The Bavarians were on them before the alarm could be properly raised. A knife in the dark, a bayonet in the back. The sentries were overwhelmed, killed quietly in the gloom before they could fire the warning shots that would alert the main garrison. The 1st Bavarian units, their presence masked by the fog, filtered into the southern streets of Bazeilles. They moved like phantoms, expecting the French to be in disarray, expecting a panicked, disorganized rabble. They expected the broken, demoralized conscripts of the line. They were wrong. They had not found conscripts. They had found the Marsouins. As the first frantic shouts of "Aux armes!" echoed through the village, the Marines did not panic. They did not run. They moved with a grim, practiced speed to their pre-assigned defensive positions. This was not a surprise to them. It was simply the start of the working day. These veterans, men who had faced ambushes in the jungles of Cochinchina and the narrow streets of Mexican towns, understood urban warfare in their bones. The village of Bazeilles, with its solid two-story stone houses, its walled gardens, its narrow, defensible alleyways and its ancient church, was not a trap. It was a fortress. It was a perfect killing ground. And the Marines, veterans of this exact kind of fighting, knew precisely how to use it. They smashed loopholes in attic walls. They barricaded ground-floor doors with heavy oak furniture. They created interlocking fields of fire that covered the main street. They were professionals, and their workday had begun. The first real contact was not a charge. It was a sound. A sharp, distinctive high-velocity crack that ripped through the muffled silence, utterly different from the dull boom of the German rifle. It was the sound of the Fusil Model 1866, the chassepot. This was the one crucial technological advantage the French possessed, the single piece of equipment that was demonstrably superior to its German counterpart. The Prussian Dries needle gun, the weapon that had won the war against Austria 4 years prior, was already obsolete. It was a marvel of its time, but its paper cartridge failed to properly seal the breech, leaking hot gas with every shot, reducing its velocity. Its effective range was, perhaps, 600 metres. The chassepot was a different beast entirely. It was a true, modern, bolt-action rifle. It used a rubber obturator, a small rubber ring that expanded on firing to create a near-perfect seal in the breech. This meant all the gas, all the explosive force, was channeled behind the bullet. The result was a rifle with a much higher muzzle velocity and a devastatingly flat trajectory. The French infantryman, trained to use its sights, could hit targets accurately at over 1,000 metres. He could kill a Prussian before the Prussian's rifle was even in effective range. In the open fields of Worth, this advantage had been squandered by bad generalship. But here, in the half-light of the village streets, it meant that every French marine firing from a darkened upper window could pick his target with lethal, unhurried precision. The Bavarians pushed forward into this labyrinth, expecting to sweep the village. Instead, they were met by a precise, invisible, and murderous fire. Their officers, the first to step into the open, were cut down. Their formations, designed for open field manoeuvres, bunched up in the narrow streets, creating perfect, dense targets for the hidden marines. The attack stalled. The Bavarians were taking casualties, and they couldn't see the enemy. And then, as the grey, foggy dawn finally broke, revealing the spectral shapes of the invaders moving through the gardens, General de Vassoigne ordered the counterattack. This was not a cautious defensive manoeuvre. It was a furious, immediate and brutal explosion of violence. The bugles sounded the charge. The Marines fixed their long, needle-like rosalie bayonets. The cry went up, "Vive la France!" And the Blue Division hit the Bavarians with the force of a tidal wave. They did not wait to be attacked. They became the attackers. They charged out of the houses, out of the alleyways, pouring into the streets they knew so well. The battle instantly, irrevocably, devolved. It was no longer a linear fight. It was no longer a contest of rifles. It became a chaotic, medieval, house-to-house brawl. This was the kind of fighting the Bavarians, trained for the rigid, open-field manoeuvres of the Prussian school, had not expected. And it was the one type of fighting that completely, utterly negated the Germans' greatest weapon, their artillery. The Krupp guns, the steel monsters on the hills overlooking Sedan, the guns that were at that very moment beginning to rain down an iron hell on the main French army, were useless here. They were blind. They could not fire into the village without killing their own men, who were now inextricably mixed with the French. This became a soldier's battle, a war of bayonets, fists, rifle butts, and sharpened shovels. The Marines, using their hard-won colonial experience, were masters of this. They barricaded doorways, fired a single volley, and then charged across the street to retake a building through the back garden. They climbed onto roofs, dropping grenades on the Bavarian reinforcements below. The Bavarians, stunned by the ferocity of this defence, were pushed back. They were pushed back, yard by bloody yard, in a desperate, swirling melee. The streets were already becoming choked with the dead and wounded, the grey fog of the morning mixing with the thick, white, acrid smoke of the chassepots rifles. The Bavarians had walked into a hornet's nest, and the hornets, it turned out, were professionals. The Bavarian commanders, watching their elite infantry reeling back from the village, were stunned. They were humiliated. They had expected a quick, decisive push against demoralised conscripts. They found themselves in a meat grinder, operated by colonial veterans who were treating this like just another Tuesday in Algeria. The cost of taking Bazeilles house by house, bayonet by bayonet, was proving to be suicidally high. General von der Tann, the Bavarian commander, realised the tactical equation had to change. He had failed to win a street fight. Very well. He would no longer try to capture Bazeilles. He would delete it. The nature of the battle changed. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, the order was given. It was an order of profound industrial brutality, one that would define the rest of the day and seal the fate of the village. The Germans stopped feeding their infantry into the maize. Instead, they brought the maize down upon the defenders. This was not the long-range arcing fire from the hills that the French were expecting. This was something new, something intimate, something terrifying. The Bavarian gun crews, with a courage bordering on madness, began manhandling their 4-pounder and 6-pounder field guns, rolling them by hand, down the main streets, right into the teeth of the French chassepot rifles. They were pushing cannons into a sniper's alley. The French Marines in the upper windows, horrified, began picking off the gunners. Men fell, horses screamed. But the Bavarians were relentless. They would drag a gun forward, losing half the crew, and then they would open fire. Point blank. We are talking ranges of 50, perhaps 100 metres. The effect was apocalyptic. A 4-pound shell, designed to punch through an infantry formation in an open field, hitting a 2-storey stone house at that range. It did not just make a hole, it detonated the entire structure. The cannonballs smashed through the facade, tore through the internal walls, and exited the back, turning the house into a see-through ruin of pulverized stone and splintered furniture. The shells transformed the defenders' barricades, their mattresses and oak tables into lethal secondary shrapnel. The Marines inside were not just shot, they were crushed. They were pulverized. The very stone walls they had trusted for protection became their tomb. And behind this rolling thunder, behind the cannons that were systematically unbuilding the village, came the second wave of the assault. They were not infantrymen. They were the brand stifter, the fire starters, Bavarian pioneers, the oil squads, moved in the shadow of the artillery. They carried cans of oil, bundles of straw, and torches. Their job was not to fight the Marines. Their job was to fight the village. As the artillery blasted a house into rubble, forcing the surviving Marines to retreat to the next block, the pioneers would rush in. They doused the shattered timbers. They soaked the collapsed roofs. And they set the ruins ablaze. The fire took hold with a terrifying speed, fed by the dry wooden beams and the tinderbox contents of the 19th century homes. The nature of the battle changed again. It was no longer a fight of infantry versus infantry. It was not even a fight of infantry versus artillery. It was now a fight of men versus fire. The village of Bazeilles was systematically, deliberately, being turned into an oven. The strategy was clear. If the Marines would not be driven out by steel, they would be roasted out by fire. The wind, which had earlier dissipated the fog, now became the Germans' greatest ally. It fanned the flames, whipping small embers into raging infernos. The fire began to spread faster than the Bavarians. It leapt across streets. It climbed walls. The main street of Bazeilles became a tunnel of roaring orange flame. The smoke, thick, black and oily, blotted out the sun. It was 9 o'clock in the morning, but the village was plunged into a choking, toxic twilight. For the French Marines still fighting, the enemy was no longer the Bavarian infantrymen. The enemy was the air itself. It was the heat. The smoke was a physical, suffocating presence, sting in their eyes, clog in their lungs. Men fell back from their loopholes, not from bullets, but because they could not breathe. They gasped for air, and what they inhaled was poison. The heat was unimaginable. The stone walls of the houses they were defending became hot to the touch. The barrels of their chassepot rifles, already hot from continuous firing, became branding irons that seared the skin from their hands. Their greatest fear was no longer the bayonet. It was the sound of a roof collapsing, the creak and groan of ancient timbers giving way, followed by a shower of sparks and a crushing final avalanche of burning slate and wood. The battle for Bazeilles was no longer a defence. It was a series of desperate, localised retreats from one burning building to the next. The Marines would hold a barricade, firing into the smoke, until the floorboards beneath their feet grew hot, until the paint on the walls began to bubble and blister. Then the cry would go up, "Retreat! To the next house!" And they would grab their wounded, dash across an open street, now swept not just by bullets, but by a literal rain of fire, and barricade themselves inside the next stone structure, knowing that the entire process would simply begin again. The Bavarians, masters of this new, terrible orchestra, followed them relentlessly. The rhythm was set. First, the percussive boom of the cannons blasting the new stronghold, then the screaming hiss of the fire, then the inevitable retreat. The village was being consumed, house by house. And in the inferno, ammunition became a traitor. The Marines' pouches filled with paper cartridges were a liability. Sparks ignited ammunition boxes. Men's own bandoliers caught fire, turning them into human bombs. The heat cooked off the cartridges in their rifles, the guns firing wildly on their own. The entire environment was an enemy. The Marines were being hunted by the very ground they stood on. The village of Bazeilles was no longer a village. It was an inferno. The streets, choked with the smoke of burning homes and the acrid stench of black powder, had become death traps, swept by Bavarian artillery fire and collapsing timbers. The Marines of the Blue Division, driven from their barricades by the relentless advance of the flames, were falling back. But this was not a rout. This was a fighting withdrawal, a professional retreat conducted by men who refused to break, their blue coats black with soot, their faces grimed, their chassepots hot to the touch. They were looking for an anchor. They were looking for one last place to make a stand. They found it. The Auberge Bourgerie. It was a solid, two-story inn near the centre of the village, owned by a man named Bourgerie. It stood at a crossroads, its thick stone walls offering a commanding field of fire down two of the main streets. It was defensible. It would have to be. A small contingent, the remnants of several companies, perhaps as few as 40, perhaps as many as 80 men, from the 2nd and 3rd Marine Infantry Regiments, poured inside. They were led by Capitaine de Vaisseau Arsène Lambert. He was a naval officer technically, but a veteran, a man who understood that his duty was not to the sea, but to the ground he stood on. He knew this position was a tomb. He also knew it was his duty to die in it, and to take as many of the enemy with him as possible. The Marines did not panic. They prepared. They used the desperate, frantic energy of men who knew they were surrounded. Barricade the doors. The heavy oak tables of the inn were overturned, stacked high, reinforced with chests of drawers and wardrobes. Upstairs, knock out the walls. Men used their rifle butts and bayonets to smash loopholes in the thick plaster and lath, creating firing positions in every room, in the attic, in the hallway. Mattresses! To the windows! Thick, heavy feather mattresses were dragged from the bedrooms and jammed into the window frames. A perfect 19th century defence, porous enough to fire through, but thick enough to absorb the low-velocity lead bullets of the Bavarian rifles. In minutes, the Auberge Bourgerie was no longer an inn. It was a fortress. It was a porcupine of high-velocity rifles. And then they found they were not alone. Trapped in the cellar, hiding from the bombardment, were several civilians. Among them was the innkeeper's wife, a woman history would remember simply as Madame Duchesne. She was terrified, but seeing the grim professionalism of the Marines, her terror turned to resolve. She would not hide. This was her home they were defending. The Bavarians, seeing the fire from the inn, realized this last pocket of resistance had to be eliminated. A regiment was tasked. They advanced, expecting a quick fight. They were met by a coordinated, disciplined storm of chassepot fire from a dozen different windows. The first wave of attackers was cut down in the street, the bullets, fired from near point-blank range, having a horrific effect. The Bavarians recoiled, stunned by the volume of fire coming from a single, seemingly isolated building. They regrouped. They tried again. They charged the front door, axes ready to smash the barricade. They were annihilated by interlocking fire from the side windows, a trap laid by Lambert. The street in front of the inn became a no-man's land, a killing zone carpeted with the grey-blue uniforms of the Bavarian infantry. The hours began to drag. 10 o'clock became 11 o'clock. The fight for Bazeilles was now focused entirely on this one building. The Bavarians, infuriated, did what they had done to the rest of the village. They brought up their cannons. They manhandled a 4-pounder gun into position, perhaps 200 yards away, and began to systematically demolish the inn, shell by shell. The stone facade began to crumble. A shell punched through the upper floor, exploding inside, killing 3 Marines instantly and wounding several others. The air filled with pulverized plaster dust, so thick the men could barely breathe. The Marines simply moved their firing positions to the other side of the building. The house was dying, but it was dying slowly. Inside this dusty, smoky, cannon-rocked hell, an extraordinary scene unfolded. The wounded were dragged to the centre of the ground floor. Ammunition was running low. The Marines were firing slower now, counting their shots, making every bullet count. And Madame Duchesne, her civilian dress covered in blood and dust, moved among them. She was not panicking. She was not weeping. She was working. She collected cartridges from the dead. She loaded rifles for the men at the windows whose hands were shaking too badly or who were wounded. She brought water from the inn's dwindling supply to the men with burning throats. She was a civilian, a mother, who had become a soldier, embodying the very spirit of the defence. The fighting reached a crescendo around 2 in the afternoon. The house was now surrounded. The Bavarians were firing from every adjacent building, from the roofs, from the gardens. The Marines were firing back. The crack, crack, crack of the chassepats had become the heartbeat of the defence. Then a new sound, a slowing, a pause, a single rifle fires, then another, then silence. Capitaine Lambert, his uniform torn, his face a mask of black powder, received the report from his sergeant. The cartridge boxes were empty. The pouches of the dead had been scavenged. The last rounds had been fired. It was over. This was the moment that the painter, Alphonse de Neuville, would later immortalize in the painting that would define the war for France. This is the scene that would be hung in every schoolhouse. The officer, Lambert, standing tall, his pistol empty. The Marine at the window, looking out, his rifle useless, his bayonet fixed, ready to meet the end. The wounded on the floor, watching. And the sergeant checking the last ammunition box, showing his officer that it is indeed empty. They had fired, as the legend would forever hold, their last cartridge. The last shot from the Auberge Bourgerie echoed flat and lonely from a shattered upstairs window. And then a silence. It was not the brief, tactical pause between volleys, not the momentary quiet of men reloading their rifles. This was a new kind of silence, a deep, profound and absolute quiet that was more terrifying than the hours of continuous, deafening battle. It was the sound of empty pouches, the sound of clicked, useless hammers on empty chambers, the sound of the end. Inside the ruined inn, the surviving Marine stood in the thick, choking, plaster-filled gloom. The air, hot as a furnace from the surrounding fires and the repeated, close-range cannon blasts, was a toxic fog of black powder smoke and the acrid, sickening stench of burning homes. Capitaine de Vaisseau Arsène Lambert, his naval uniform in tatters, his face a mask of black powder and dried blood, received the final, inevitable report. A sergeant, his voice a dry, rasping croak from thirst and smoke, held up the last empty wooden cartridge box. He shook it. It was a hollow, wooden rattle, a sound that confirmed the impossible. They were gone. All of them. The Marines of the 2nd Regiment had, as the legend would forever hold, fired their last cartridge. Outside, in the ruined streets, the Bavarian infantry, who had been massing for the final, overwhelming assault, also paused. The roar of their supporting artillery, which had been methodically turning the inn to rubble, lessened. The constant, angry crack of rifles probing the walls faded, replaced by shouted questions from the German NCOs. The battle, which had been a deafening, continuous explosion for 6 agonizing hours, now held its breath. The Germans, sensing this sudden, unnatural quiet, were confused. Was it a trap? A ruse to lure them into one final, desperate bayonet charge? Or was it finally the end? Inside the inn, the surviving Marines looked at their captain. They were perhaps 40 men left alive in this one building, maybe fewer. Most of them were wounded, propped against the shattered walls, their blue coats dark and sticky with blood, their chaspas now nothing more than steel-tipped pikes. Perhaps only a dozen, maybe 15, were still on their feet, still capable of fighting, still capable of standing. They looked at Lambert, their eyes hollow and red-rimmed in their blackened faces. They fixed their bayonets. The movement was slow, weary, but disciplined. They could wait. They could wait for the Germans to realize the firing had stopped, to storm the broken barricades, to pour through the cannon-blasted holes in the walls. They could meet them here, in the rubble of the ground floor, and finish the fight with cold steel. It would be an honourable death, a soldier's death, a glorious, futile end that would be spoken of in barracks for years. Or they could surrender. Lambert, a veteran who had seen enough death for one lifetime, a commander whose primary duty was no longer to hold the village, but to preserve the lives of the men who had shown such impossible courage, made his choice. They had done their duty. They had held their position for more than 6 hours. They had held back an entire Bavarian regiment. They had bought time for an army that was, he already knew, defeated. There was no more honour to be found in a pointless final massacre of the few men, and the civilians like Madame Duchesne still breathing beside him. He gave the order. A white cloth. They needed a white cloth. A man tore a strip from a wounded soldier's shirt. Another found a napkin in the debris of the inn's ruined kitchen. The details are lost, but a piece of white fabric was found tied to the bent barrel of a chassepot. A Marine, his hand shaking from exhaustion, pushed it through a shattered window, waving it slowly back and forth in the smoky, grey afternoon air. The German rifles fell silent. The cannons stopped. A single Bavarian officer, often identified in the histories as a major, perhaps von der Tann himself, a commander whose regiment had been bled white by this single cursed house, stepped out from behind a shattered barricade. He walked slowly, alone, his pistol still in its holster, a gesture of cautious respect, his boots crunching on the rubble and the spent brass. He approached the ruined inn. He was expecting a full company to emerge. He had lost, by some estimates, hundreds of his own men trying to take this one building. The sheer volume of disciplined, accurate and continuous fire that had poured from these windows, holding off multiple assaults, could only have come from a large, well-armed and fanatically led force. He braced himself for the formal, sullen surrender of perhaps 100, maybe 200, battle-hardened French Marines. The barricade at the main door, a pile of shattered oak tables and upturned wardrobes, was slowly, painfully, pulled aside from within. The door creaked open. Captain Lambert emerged first. He stood tall, what remained of his naval uniform scorched and torn, his face a grim mask, his sword still at his side, ready to present it. He was followed by his men, but it was not a company. It was not a platoon. It was a handful. A dozen, perhaps 15 unwounded soldiers, walking stiffly, their rifles held uselessly, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. And behind them came the wounded, dozens more, supported by their comrades, staggering, bleeding, emerging from the smoky darkness into the pale, shocking light. The German major stopped. He stared. He looked at the handful of survivors. He looked at the piles of his own Bavarian dead carpeting the street. He looked back at the exhausted, soot-blackened, hollow-eyed faces of the Frenchmen who had held him off for half a day. He simply could not reconcile the two. He could not understand. This tiny, broken group. This was what had shattered his regiment. This was the force that had fought with such demonic professional fury. The Bavarian commander, a product of a military tradition that respected courage above all else, a man who knew what it cost to stand and fight, was overcome. The legend, born in this moment and immortalized by de Neuville's painting, is that the major did not accept their surrender. He did not mock them. He did not treat them as vanquished foes. He raised his hand, not in anger, but in a slow, deliberate salute. It was the ultimate spontaneous gesture of a soldier's respect, a recognition that on this day, in this one small, burning house, these Frenchmen had shown a bravery that transcended the borders of nations and the outcome of the battle. He reportedly stepped forward and offered Captain Lambert his own flask, a gesture of honour from one professional warrior to another. The battle for the Auberge Bourgerie was over. The heroic suicidal stand at the Auberge Bourgerie was the final punctuation mark on a day of total disaster. Captain Lambert's salute from his enemy was a moment of profound military honour, a flicker of humanity in the inferno, but it was a salute exchanged in the ruins of a battlefield that had already been definitively lost. The sacrifice of the Blue Division, while legendary, was tactically, strategically, and utterly futile. It could not change the larger, catastrophic reality unfolding just a few miles away. It could not save the Emperor. It could not save the army. It could not save France. As the firing finally died down in the late afternoon, the village of Bazeilles ceased to exist. It was no longer a town. It was a smoking, smouldering collective tomb. The German strategy of deleting the village had been horrifically successful. Houses were hollowed-out shells, their contents burning in the streets. Roofs had collapsed, burying both defenders and attackers in their final, desperate embrace. The streets were choked with rubble, with the bloated carcasses of dead horses from the Bavarian artillery teams, and with the corpses of French and German soldiers, often lying side by side where they had fallen in the house-to-house brawls. The cost for the inhabitants was catastrophic. French accusations of Bavarian atrocities began almost immediately, and would poison relations for a generation. Reports, though confused and inflamed by wartime propaganda, told of civilians being shot, bayoneted, or simply left to burn in the cellars where they were hiding. While German sources would later contest these claims, arguing that civilians had fired on their troops, the undeniable reality was that dozens of non-combatants, estimates range from 39 to perhaps over 100, were killed in the crossfire and the flames. Bazeilles was not just a battlefield, it was a massacre. The military cost for the Blue Division was, in a word, annihilation. The troops de marine, those colonial professionals who had been the army's backbone, had been broken. In that single, desperate day of fighting in and around Bazeilles, the division suffered approximately 2,600 and 55 casualties. They had held their ground. They had fought to the last, but they were gone. The Bavarians, however, had paid a heavy, heavy price for this one village. Reliable casualty figures for the German side are difficult to isolate, but estimates suggest they suffered over 4,000, perhaps even 5,000 men killed and wounded just to take this one sector. The Marines, in their defeat, had extracted a terrible toll from their elite attackers. But this entire, heroic, agonizing drama was a sideshow. It was a footnote to the main event. While the Marines were fighting and dying in the burning streets of Bazeilles, the true catastrophe had unfolded in the valley. The main French army, the 100,000 men of the army of Chalon, had been systematically, scientifically, and completely destroyed. Moltke's ring of steel, hundreds of Krupp cannons firing from the hills of La Marfée and flowing, had rained an inescapable hell down upon the trapped French formations. The French army was not being fought, it was being shelled. It was an execution from above. The French artillery, still mostly bronze muzzle-loaders, tried to fight back, but they were hopelessly outranged, their positions given away by their own smoke, their batteries silenced one by the precise, invisible fire of the steel Krupp guns. The French infantry, the demoralized conscripts of the line, huddled in the ditches and behind the walls of Sedan, unable to advance, unable to retreat, able to do nothing but die. In a final, desperate and magnificent act of suicidal courage, the French cavalry was unleashed. General Marguerite led his chasseurs d'Afrique, the elite light cavalry, in a desperate charge up the slopes of Floing. It was a charge into the history books and into a wall of lead. The Prussian infantry, secure in their positions, watched them come. They formed steady lines and waited. They opened fire with their dry needle guns, a disciplined, rolling fire that tore the charge to pieces. Horses and men went down in a screaming, tumbling mass. Marguerite himself was hit in the face, a terrible wound that would kill him. They reformed. They charged again and again. The chasseurs d'Afrique and the cuirassiers charged the Prussian lines 12 separate times. It was a display of courage that stunned even the Germans who were killing them. But it was useless. It was the romantic, Napoleonic past charging headlong into the industrial, machine-like present. The present won. The cavalry was shattered. And the Emperor, Napoleon the Third, sick in agony from his bladder stones, his face rouged by aids to hide his deathly pallor, had ridden aimlessly among his panicked, disintegrating troops. He rode not to command, but to die. He rode deliberately into the heaviest artillery fire, seeking the random shell, the soldier's death that would spare him the humiliation of surrender. But the cannons which killed thousands of his men would not grant him this one last favour. By the next morning, September 2nd, 1870, the choice was gone. The white flags were raised over the citadel of Sedan. Napoleon the Third, Emperor of the French, a man who bore the greatest name in military history, surrendered himself and his entire army of 83,000 surviving men to the King of Prussia. It was a disaster unprecedented in modern history. An emperor captured on the battlefield, an entire army annihilated in a single day. The Second French Empire, which had dominated Europe for 2 decades, had collapsed. It died in the mud of the Meuse Valley. The sacrifice at Bazeilles, the Last Cartridge, the heroic stand of the Blue Division, it had all been for nothing. It had not changed the outcome. It had not saved the army. It had only served as the tragic, defiant epilogue to the death of an empire. France had lost. The Second Empire was dead. Its emperor a prisoner in German hands. Its main armies annihilated or besieged. The humiliation was absolute, a national trauma that left a vacuum of power, of honour, and of identity. But history, especially French history, abhors a vacuum. Into this void stepped a new government, proclaimed in the streets of Paris just 2 days after the disaster at Sedan, on September 4th, 1870, the Third Republic. This new, fragile government, born from the ashes of imperial failure, led by men like Léon Gambetta, faced an impossible task. They had to continue the war, which they vowed to do, but they had no professional army left with which to fight. Bazaine was trapped in Metz, the army of Chalons was gone, and the Germans were already marching relentlessly on Paris. They had to rally a broken, bewildered and betrayed people. And to do that, they needed a new story. They needed a new legend. They could not build a narrative on the reality of Sedan. They could not rally a nation around an image of a captured emperor and 83,000 surrendered soldiers. They needed an antidote to the shame. They needed a foundational myth, and they found it in the smoking ruins of Bazeilles. The stand of the Marsouins became, almost overnight, the single most important narrative of the war. It was a story actively, brilliantly, and consciously cultivated. Why? Because it contained everything the story of Sedan lacked. It was not a story of incompetence at the top, but of professionalism at the bottom. It was not a story of systemic collapse, but of individual endurance. It was not a story of surrender, but of defiance to the very last. The tactical defeat was irrelevant. The moral victory was everything. The new, fragile republic needed a symbol, a physical embodiment of this new narrative. They needed a way to make this story immortal. In 1873, after the war had been lost and the humiliating peace treaty signed, the government of the new republic commissioned a painter, Alphonse de Neuville. De Neuville was not an abstract artist. He was a master of la peinture militaire, a man who specialized in capturing the precise, gritty, almost journalistic details of the conflict, but elevating them with a profound, undeniable sense of heroism. The painting he delivered, Les Dernières Cartouches, the Last Cartridges, became perhaps the most important and most famous piece of propaganda in 19th century France. This was not a grand classical painting of gods and heroes, or a romantic chaotic canvas like a Delacroix. It was something new. It was intimate. It was claustrophobic. It was real. De Neuville captured the scene inside the Auberge Bourgerie with a precision that was almost photographic, based on the eyewitness accounts of the survivors. We see the room. It is a tomb. The air is thick with plaster dust from the cannon blasts and the acrid smoke of the chassepôts. The floor is littered with spent cartridges, broken furniture, and the bodies of the dead. And in the centre of this ruin, we see the defenders. We see the officer, Captain Lambert, standing tall, his naval uniform torn, his face a mask of grim determination, his empty pistol smoking in his hand. We see the Marine at the window, his rifle useless, his bayonet now fixed, ready to meet the end with cold steel. We see the wounded man on the floor, his head bandaged, watching his comrades, his role in the fight over. We see the civilian, Madame Duchesne, her face pale but resolute, bravely loading a rifle for one of the soldiers. She is not a victim. She is a participant. She is la patrie, the homeland, fighting alongside her sons. And then the central, heartbreaking moment of the legend. The sergeant, his back to the viewer, is checking the last wooden ammunition box. It is empty. He holds it up to his officer. The last cartridge has been fired. This painting became the antidote to the shame of Sedan. It was not about a failed emperor. It was about a dutiful captain. It was not about a panicked army. It was about a disciplined, unbreakable squad. The government, recognizing its power, reproduced the painting as engravings and distributed it across the nation. It was hung in virtually every schoolhouse in the new republic. An entire generation of French children, the children who would be the officers and soldiers of 1914, grew up looking at this image. It taught them what it meant to be French. It meant you did not surrender when the emperor failed. You did not break when outnumbered. You stood your ground. You fought with honour and professionalism, to the very last. The Blue Division, the Troupes de Marine, became the ideal, the very symbol of the new Republican Army. They were not the corrupt, aristocratic and ultimately failed Imperial Guard of Napoleon the Third. They were professionals. They were dutiful. They were prepared to sacrifice everything for the patrie. The disaster at Sedan was the fault of one man, the Emperor. The honour of France, the painting declared, was saved by the common soldier, by the Marine, by the anonymous hero in the blue coat. France had lost the war, a war started by an emperor. But in this painting it won the narrative, a narrative that would belong to the Republic. The auberge bourgeoisie itself, that simple, two-story stone inn, survived the inferno. Or rather, its skeleton did. While the village around it was reduced to blackened foundations and heaps of ash, the inn stood defiant, its stone walls pockmarked, cratered, and scarred by thousands of Bavarian bullets and the direct, brutal impacts of point-blank artillery fire. It was too important to be allowed to crumble. It was a relic. It became a shrine. Almost immediately after the war, the decision was made to preserve it. It became La Maison de la Dernière Cartouche, the House of the Last Cartridge. It was perhaps the first modern military museum of its kind, a national site of pilgrimage. For decades, French citizens, veterans and schoolchildren would make the journey to this small, rebuilt village. They would walk through the very rooms where Lambert, his officers and his Marines had fought and died. They could see the bullet holes. They could see the cannon breaches, the bloodstains left on the floorboards. They could stand in the exact spot where the sergeant held up the empty ammunition box. It was not an abstract story in a book. It was a physical place, a tomb, an altar. It was the physical anchor for the memory of an entire nation. But the legacy of Bazeilles was not just stone and dust. It became a living, breathing tradition, burned into the very soul of the Troupes de Marine. To this day, the Marsouins, the porpoises, celebrate Bazeilles Day. It is not just another date on the calendar. It is the foundational event of their service. Every year, on the 1st of September, in barracks across France and on deployments around the globe, the story is formally retold by an officer to the assembled troops. It is their defining moment of identity. It is their Rorke's drift. It is their Alamo. It is the standard against which every Marine is measured. The battle honours for Bazeilles are emblazoned on their standards. The anchor insignia they wear is a symbol not just of their colonial origins, but of the unyielding tenacity demonstrated in that burning village. Bazeilles gave the Marines their soul, and that comparison to Rorke's drift is not an accident. It is the absolute key to understanding the battle's impact on the wider world. Just 9 years later, in 1879, a small garrison of the British 24th Foot, the Warwickshire Regiment, would find themselves in a remarkably similar position. They were trapped at a remote mission station in Zululand. They too were in a single, fortified building complex. They too were facing overwhelming odds, thousands of Zulu warriors fresh from the massacre at Isandlwana. And who was the artist commissioned to capture that moment of supreme British heroism? The very same painter, Alphonse de Neuville. the Victorian world understood. De Neuville, who had achieved international fame with Last Cartridge, was the only man who could capture the spirit of Rorke's Drift. His two paintings are spiritual twins. They are the same story, told in two different uniforms. It was the ultimate expression of the 19th century professional soldier: iron discipline, superior breech-loading firepower, and a stoic refusal to break, even when surrounded by thousands. But there is one profound, critical difference that explains everything about the French mindset. Rorke's Drift was a stunning, improbable victory. The British held the post. The Zulus retreated. Bazeilles was a catastrophic, undeniable defeat. The Marines were killed or captured. The village was lost. The army surrendered. The British celebrated a win. The French, in Bazeilles, chose to celebrate the honour found in annihilation. They built their national myth not around the success of the mission, but around the character of the men who failed it. They proved that how you fought and how you died mattered more than the tactical outcome. The Last Cartridge became a more potent symbol for France than 1,000 easy victories. And beneath this powerful symbolism, Bazeilles offered a terrifying modern military lesson, one that would be relearned in blood, again and again. It was a prototype for the brutal arithmetic of 20th century urban warfare. It proved that a small, well-led professional force could use the complex, three-dimensional terrain of a built-up environment, the stone houses, the cellars, the interlocking alleyways, the attics, to inflict massive, disproportionate, and ultimately unacceptable casualties on a vastly superior foe. The Bavarians had tens of thousands of men in the sector, but they could only bring a few hundred to bear at any one time, funneling them into the pre-sighted killing zones of the chassepot rifle. Bazeilles was a lesson in how to bleed an army dry, one narrow street, one barricaded house, one last cartridge at a time. It was a lesson the Germans themselves would take to heart, and one the world would see again, written in fire and rubble, in the streets of Stalingrad and Hue. In the end, the Battle of Bazeilles was a catastrophic defeat. The village was erased. The army was captured. The Second Empire died in that valley. But military history is not always written by the victors. It is often written by those who best understand the power of a story. The new German Empire won the war, a victory forged by Krupp steel and flawless logistics. But France, with its story of the Last Cartridge, won the narrative of honour. The legacy of Bazeilles was not a lesson in tactics. The tactics, in the end, had failed. It was not a lesson in strategy. The strategy had been disastrous. It was a lesson in something far more potent, something the British understood at Balaclava and Rorke's Drift. It was a lesson in will. It was the defiant spirit, the proof that even in total annihilation, a nation's soul could be preserved by the actions of a few. The Germans had won the field, but the French had captured the memory. This spirit, forged in the ashes of Bazeilles, was the spirit that the Third Republic desperately needed. It was the spirit that would be needed again, just 44 years later, when the German army returned, this time in greater numbers, with bigger guns. And another generation of French soldiers, men who had grown up looking at de Neuville's painting, were told to hold, at all costs, in the infernal, grinding, muddy trenches of Verdun. The thin blue line had been broken, but it had created a legend of defiance that would define France for the next century.